Hello, and thanks for coming to my show. If you don't already know, this show is done in themed seasons, and we're on Season 18, Killer Kids. If you like this channel, not necessarily the crimes, you can hit like on the video and subscribe to the channel for weekly stories. You can also check out my other channel, Somewhere Sinister, which isn't entirely true crime, more true crime adjacent. A link is in the description. Thanks. When a 16-year-old boy who believed he was a 500-year-old vampire learned that one of his friends wanted to escape her family, he was immediately willing to help. He made a plan to help her run away, but just running away wasn't enough. In order for her to be truly free, he needed to make sure her parents would not be able to come after her. This is Monsters. Roderick Ferrell was born on March 28, 1980 in Murray, Kentucky. His umbilical cord was wrapped around his neck and he almost died during labor. His mother, Sandra Gibson, believes that trauma affected his brain. She dropped out of high school at 16 and started working at McDonald's. The following year she got pregnant and she married Rod's father, Rick Ferrell. That marriage lasted all of 3 weeks and soon the couple were divorced. Rick remained in his son's life for a while, but eventually stopped visiting because he claimed Sandra made things too difficult. Sandra relied on support from her parents, Harold and Rosetta Gibson, who were Pentecostal fundamentalists. They did their best to ignore their daughter's behavior, and when they moved to Florida, Sandra and Rod followed. When Sandra wasn't working at fast food restaurants, she made money stripping and even selling her body. She raised Rod to be more of a friend than a son, and that coupled with her own emotional immaturity made the boy grow up to not be able to handle authority. Rod's childhood was marred by alleged abuse. Court documents reveal claims that he was sexually abused by his maternal grandfather at the age of 5. However, it's important to note that no criminal charges were ever filed regarding those allegations. That traumatic background set the stage for Rod's later fascination with the occult and his eventual descent into the world of fantasy and violence. As a teenager, Rod began to explore the darker aspects of fantasy and role-playing games. His interest in games like Dungeons & Dragons and Vampire the Masquerade soon evolved into a more serious fascination with vampirism. That interest was partially influenced by Sandra, who admitted to dabbling in vampirism herself. Rod's bedroom became a shrine to the occult, filled with dark imagery and literature. He surrounded himself with inverted crosses, broken shards of glass, and books like the Necronomicon and the Satanic Bible. That environment fueled his growing obsession with the vampire lifestyle. When Rosetta's mother became ill and needed support, the Gibsons, along with Sandra and Rod, moved back to Murray. The small town of Murray was a complete 180 from Florida. Rod didn't fit in at all amongst the conservative church-going townsfolk. He dressed in all black and had long dark hair, trying his best to emulate a vampire. Sandra dressed the same way, and neighbors in their apartment complex regularly mistook them for boyfriend and girlfriend. Sandra eventually got into legal trouble for writing sexually explicit letters to a 14-year-old boy who had moved away. In the letters, she tried to convince the teen to move back, becoming a vampire and to have sex with her. She was given 5 years of probation in order to get a psychiatric evaluation, but it was far too late to reverse the damage that had been done to Rod. The 16-year-old had already quit school and was hanging out with other youth in the area, building up a vampiristic cult. He found kindred spirits in other disaffected teenagers who were drawn to the idea of belonging to something greater than themselves. Among his early followers were Scott Anderson, Dana Cooper, and Charity Casey. The group eventually grew to about 30 teens that called themselves the Vampire Clan. Rod's charisma and his ability to weave fantastical stories about vampires and immortality proved irresistible to those troubled teens. They participated in initiation rituals at local cemeteries where they would drink each other's blood to cross over into vampirism. That act of blood sharing was seen as a profound and irreversible commitment to their new lifestyle. The group's activities didn't go unnoticed in the conservative religious community of Murray. Their all-black attire, gothic music preferences, and rumors of blood-drinking rituals set them apart from their peers. However, that outsider status only served to strengthen the bonds within the group. Rod's situation at home had become more violent. When he would get angry, he would chase his mother with a knife. She filed a beyond parental control report with the court. She said that Rod had threatened to kill her multiple times, he was using drugs and was injuring himself. She said she tried to punish him, but he would just ignore her. Rod met with a caseworker and promised to go to counseling and return home on time at night, but he didn't end up keeping those promises. After becoming obsessed with the role-playing game Vampire the Masquerade, Rod began telling people that he was actually a 500-year-old vampire named Visago. He became friends with another influential wannabe vampire in town named Jaden, whose real name was Stephen Murphy. They began spending a lot of time together, which had its ups and downs. They both wanted to be the superior vampire and would get into fights often. One of those fights ended with Jaden being charged with assault, and after a short jail sentence, Jaden was ordered to stay away from Rod. The two would end up ignoring the order so they could team up against Sandra because the 14-year-old she was sexually harassing was actually Jaden's younger brother. Rod initially tried to make a plan with Jaden to kill his mother and his grandfather, but Jaden wouldn't go for it. Then Rod suggested they take off and head to Florida. Jaden suggested they move to Baton Rouge, but there was a reason that Ron was focused on Florida. Rod's influence grew as he continued to recruit new members. He saw himself as a protector and savior for those who felt lost or misunderstood. That self-perception was reinforced when he learned about the troubles of a friend he had had in Florida before he had moved. Heather Wendorf, a troubled teenager from Eustis, told him that she was in hell at home with her parents. Heather's complaints about her family's situation resonated with Rod, who saw an opportunity to play the role of a dark knight rescuing a damsel in distress. Rod would spend hours on the phone with Heather, which were long-distance calls at the time, and ended up putting $2,000 worth of charges on his mother's phone bill. Jaden had finally had enough of Rod after he saw him kill a cat and cut ties. The vampire clan was a game to the other members. A place to belong and be supported by like-minded people. Once most of the other members learned that Rod was taking life, killing animals, they believed he had taken the game too far. He seemed to really believe that he was a vampire. Of course, not every one of the clan cut ties with Rod. He had a girlfriend named Charity Casey. She was young and naive, and Rod was able to manipulate her easily. After Rod had had his final falling out with Jaden, people tried to warn her to stay away from Rod, but she believed that they were in love. Rod also had a friend named Howard Scott Anderson, who went by Scott. He came from an abusive and neglectful household. His father, Howard Anderson Sr., was an alcoholic who would get angry easily. He was charged with felony assault after striking Scott's mother Martha over the head with a bottle. She refused to testify against him and the charge was eventually dropped. Social workers had been to the house for reports of neglect for years before Martha finally just told them to take the children. They were placed into the foster system for 2 years before being returned to their parents. Eventually, Rod had nothing left in Murray and decided that it was time to go rescue Heather. Another friend from Florida, a girl named Janine LeClaire, had sent Rod a drawing of the layout of the Wendorf house. At the beginning of November in 1996, Rod and Scott started getting ready to leave Kentucky. It's never been proven, but authorities believe that the teens robbed a Shoney's restaurant. That gave them the cash they needed, so they started looking for a vehicle. In Eustis, Heather and Janine fantasized about death. Janine was in love with Rod and she was expecting him to return, so she bided her time by creating a fake world and pretending to live in the past. She and Heather would go out in Victorian-era garb that they found at vintage clothing shops. It was quite a contrast against the backdrop of a Floridian resort town. Heather grew even darker, hanging dead flowers and upside-down crosses all over her bedroom. 15-year-old Heather was the youngest of 4 children born to Rick Wendorf and Naomi Ruth Queen. She had 2 half-sisters who Ruth had had with her first husband. She also had an older full sister named Jennifer. Technically, Ruth was still married to her first husband, but pretended that she was Mrs. Wendorf. They had lived in Orlando, but eventually Rick was promoted, which came with a move to a different location. They were able to buy 5 acres in the country in Eustis and had a house built on the lot. Heather and Jennifer had a pretty privileged life. They had yearly passes to Disney World, a large house with a pool, and their parents had fully funded college accounts for them. Rick was very responsible financially and had invested in companies like Disney and McDonald's, which ended up paying off nicely. Heather and Jenny had made a contract to be best friends forever. As Jenny got older and earned the freedom of a driver's license, she began missing curfew and got into trouble from time to time, but Heather seemed to be doing fairly well at home. The stories she was telling Rod about how horrible her home life was were entirely untrue. She had supposedly made up stories telling Rod that her parents were physically abusive, something she would later deny. A few days before heading south, Rod asked his grandfather, Harold Gibson, for a ride to a friend's house. It was conveniently out in the middle of nowhere. As they traveled along a rural road in his Jeep, they were flagged down by Scott, who said he was having car problems. Harold could sense that something was up, so he just kept driving. Miraculously, Scott's car fixed itself and he started following them. Harold became extremely suspicious when Rod started fidgeting with something inside his jacket pocket. Sensing that his grandson might have a knife, he made it back to town and pulled into the parking lot of the police station. Then he told Rod to get out. Harold would later tell investigators about the incident, believing that the boys were planning to steal his vehicle. It's unclear why they didn't want to take Scott's 1987 Buick Skyhawk, probably wanting something more reliable. But after the failed carjacking, that's exactly what they ended up using. Rod and Scott, along with Charity and her friend Dana Cooper, drove 12 hours from Murray, Kentucky to Eustis, Florida. On November 25, 1996, Jenny tiptoed into her house on Green Tree Lane in Eustis. She was 20 minutes past her curfew and was hoping that her parents wouldn't notice. She thought that she had gotten lucky as she could see her father laying on the couch and it seemed like he was asleep, so she snuck into her room. She went to pick up her phone to call her boyfriend and let him know that she got home safe, but the cord had been ripped out of the wall. See, in 1996, phones had to stay in the house connected by a cord. It was a crazy time. She thought that Heather had gotten mad and damaged the phone, so she went into another room and found a phone to use, then went back downstairs to get something to eat. That's when she saw the blood. As she got into the kitchen, she saw her mother laying on the floor covered in blood. She ran back to the living room to get her father, and that's when she realized that he wasn't really sleeping. She called emergency services and told them that her parents had been killed. Sheriff's Deputy Jeff Taylor was the first on the scene. The ambulance arrived right after, and they waited outside with Jenny as the deputy cleared the residence. There was nobody in the house beside the bodies of Rick and Ruth. Rick was laying on the couch, which was soaked in blood. He had been beaten so badly that he was unrecognizable. Deputy Taylor would later testify that the man's face looked like hamburger. Ruth had also been beaten to death, and part of her skull was found in the dining room. The missing piece made her brain stem visible, which made some investigators think she might have been shot. That would later be confirmed by the medical examiner to not be the case. Investigators found multiple doors on the backside of the house ajar. The forensics team found blood that didn't belong to the victim and shoe prints outside. They found a butcher knife by the front door, but it turned out that the Wendorfs used it as a gardening tool. They also found a pocket knife on the floor near Rick, but it had just slipped out of his pocket and wasn't used in the attack. One interesting detail was that investigators learned that someone had used a wet finger to write 666 on the door from the garage into the house. It seemed that that was the attacker's point of entry. The autopsy revealed a V-shaped burn mark on Rick's body. It was determined that they were cigarette burns. The investigators would later be told by someone in Kentucky that the V was Rod's mark, representing his vampire name Visago. When Jenny was asked who she thought would want her parents dead, the name she gave them was Heather. Then she told them about Rod. She said that Heather was constantly in trouble for high phone bills and she would get really angry over it. Jenny also described a time that Heather had suggested Rod kill someone for her the next time he was visiting. She finally told them about a time when they were laying in their bedroom late at night, just talking. Eventually, after a short silence, Heather asked her, quote, "Jen, have you ever plotted Mom and Dad's death?" She explained that Heather should have been home when she got home. She wasn't allowed to be out that late. Jenny also noted that a Ford Explorer belonging to her parents was missing from the scene. Investigators found Scott's Skyhawk parked on a road near Interstate 4. The car was sealed and then towed to the sheriff's office. When the vehicle was examined, investigators found cigarette butts, a nickel, a pair of boots, and fibers. They also noted that the license plate had been switched out for the ones belonging to Wendorf's vehicle. Now they were looking for a Ford Explorer with the license plates from Scott's car. While the Wendorf house was still crawling with police, Janine's mother, Suzanne LeClaire, arrived and told police she needed to talk to Rick and Ruth. She obviously had no idea the couple were dead and was in shock when she found out. When a detective asked her what she needed to tell the victims, she explained that Heather was planning to run away. When she told the detective that her daughter had told her about the plan, he asked her to go get Janine and bring her back to the scene. Janine went on to tell the investigator all about how she had met Ron and how she introduced him to Heather. After Rod moved to Kentucky, they continued communicating and Heather became obsessed with becoming a vampire. After convincing Rod that she was being abused by her parents, they began making plans to run away. That plan was moved up after Rod got into some trouble in Murray and needed to get out of town. Rod and his friends showed up in Eustis on the evening of November 25th and picked up Heather. She arrived at Janine's house at about 8:30 p.m., tapping on her bedroom window. She asked her friend to come with her, but Janine said she couldn't. Janine would later tell investigators that she was losing interest in the vampire cult and had actually been getting more involved in her church. After the clan left Janine's house, they went to visit Heather's boyfriend so she could say goodbye. The thing was, Rod and Scott were not with them. They had been left at the Wendorf house when Heather was picked up. Rod and Scott went into the house through the garage where Rod picked up a crowbar. Then they snuck into the house where Rick was snoozing on the couch and Ruth was in the shower. Without warning, Rod launched a brutal attack on the sleeping man. He struck him repeatedly with the crowbar, fracturing his skull and ribs. The assault was so violent that Rick died almost instantly. The noise alerted Ruth just as she had finished showering. As she entered the room, she encountered the intruders. In a moment of panic and rage, Rod turned his aggression towards the woman. According to his later confession, he had initially planned to let her live. However, when she allegedly threw a cup of scalding coffee at him, Rod's anger exploded. He struck her with the crowbar, hitting her with such force that it severed her brainstem, killing her instantly. The brutality of the murders would shock even Rod's accomplices. Scott was stunned, having never witnessed such violence before. The scene was one of unimaginable horror, with both victims lying lifeless in their own home. Once they were dead, Rod reportedly burned his symbol, the letter V, into Rick's body. Investigators were told that the group of teens were planning to head to New Orleans, Louisiana, but the authorities had trouble tracking them down. When Charity called her mother, the number showed up on her caller ID and the area code was from Baton Rouge. That's when the Baton Rouge police began hunting the killers. They traced the number to a payphone across the street from 2 motels. While they were talking to the clerk in one of them, Charity and Dana walked into the lobby. They went back to their room and all 4 suspects were placed under arrest. Rod was read his rights and placed into a police cruiser to be taken to the station. On the way, he kept telling the officer that he would tell him everything and that he would make him famous. The officer told him to be quiet and even read him his rights again, hoping he would take the hint. In an interrogation room, Rod was questioned by an FBI agent while the Lake County Sheriff's detectives were still on their way from Florida. During that interview, Rod explained that he had picked up Charity before they left Murray. He said that they were engaged and it turned out that she was pregnant. They went and picked up Dana, and Scott was supposed to pick his brothers up from a skating rink, so Rod made Charity go in and tell them that Scott had been kidnapped by Jaden. When they got to Eustis, they went to a friend's house and called Heather, telling her that it was time to go. They went to Heather's house, and then she went with Charity and Dana to her boyfriend's house, but Rod and Scott stayed there. Rod checked the perimeter and learned that the Wendorfs left all of their doors unlocked. After grabbing the crowbar, they entered the house and realized that Rick was asleep and Ruth was in the shower. Rod said he looked around the house a bit first and got a drink because he was thirsty. Once he had quenched his thirst, Rod started beating Rick on his head. He said he hit him over and over until he stopped breathing, and it felt like it took 20 minutes, though it was likely pretty quick. Once he was dead, he rolled his body over and looked through his wallet where he found a Discover card. That was when Ruth came down the stairs and splashed her hot cup of coffee on him. Rod explained that Ruth hadn't immediately noticed her husband, so she thought they were just robbing them. She asked him what he wanted, but before he could answer, she lunged at him. Rod said he hit her in the head with the crowbar, and when she hit the ground, he continued to hit her until he saw her brain. He said the coffee really pissed him off. He also said that he was considering waiting for Jenny to get home, but decided it wasn't worth it. When the agent asked about Scott's involvement in the murder, Rod said he initially followed him into the house like a lost puppy, and when the killing started, he just froze. After the Wendorfs were dead, they looked around the house a bit. They took a pearl necklace and a hunting knife. Then they found a set of keys for the Explorer, but when they got in it, there was already a set in the ignition. They took the Explorer to Janine's house, but the girls weren't there. They eventually met up with them and drove both cars to an out-of-the-way location near the interstate and ditched Scott's vehicle. Then they headed east to New Orleans, where Rod believed they could start over as a vampire family. While they were wandering around in a pretty bad part of town, Charity started to freak out. Rod said that she had never been to a city before and was scared. That's when they headed to Baton Rouge. They got a motel room and were pretty much out of money at that point. Charity used the payphone to call her mother to see if she could get some money, but her mother refused and reported the call to the police. Rod told the agent that he knew the call would get them caught and urged the others to leave, but they wouldn't listen. He said he was going to drive out to a heavily wooded area, put the Explorer into a lake, and then live in the woods hunting animals. Rod went on to tell the agent that his grandfather was also a murderer and he was part of an organization called the Black Mask. He claimed that, when he was 5, the group had chosen him to be the guardian of the Black Mask, which meant he had to become one with everyone in the group. That entailed the members sexually assaulting him and then sacrificing someone in front of him. Rod was your average brooding teenager who lived in a fantasy world in order to escape his life. The idea that he had been involved with a death cult when he was 5 years old was as likely as him being a 500-year-old vampire. When Heather was interviewed, she explained her relationship with Rod and said that she had not told him to kill her parents. He had suggested it before and she told him no. She said she had learned about the murder when they were on their way to New Orleans. Rod backed up that story by telling investigators that he had only planned to kill the Wendorfs 10 minutes before he did. Otherwise, they were just planning to rob the house. When the detective asked if Heather had discussed planning her parents' murder with her sister, she said no. During Scott's interview, he claimed that he had not known anything about killing the Wendorfs when they went to the house that night. He froze up immediately when Rod started beating them to death. Rod Ferrell was charged with first-degree murder, armed robbery, and armed burglary. Scott Anderson, Dana Cooper, and Charity Casey were all charged with being principals to murder, armed robbery, and armed burglary. Heather Wendorf was not charged with a crime. As the defendants waited their day in court, Rod's lawyer made a public statement assuring the crime had nothing to do with vampirism, a decision he would soon regret. In the middle of December, Rod did an interview for the Orlando Sentinel where he told the paper that a rival vampire cult was responsible for the murder and they were setting him up. The next day's front page headline read, "Interview with a Vampire." In the article, Rod blamed the double murder on his old friend Jaden. He said Jaden was retaliating for Rod going against him. Of course, there was no evidence that Jaden or anyone in his group had left Kentucky. Jaden had been at a local Hardee's fast food restaurant in Murray on the night of the murders. Rod's next proclamation was that he had multiple personalities and would regularly black out. When he was examined by a psychiatrist, they found no evidence that he was suffering from any condition that would give him multiple personalities. When none of that worked, he decided to plead guilty to 2 counts of felony murder and was sentenced to death. Scott was found guilty of the same charges as Rod and was sentenced to life in prison. Charity and Dana were both found guilty of 2 counts of third-degree murder, robbery with a deadly weapon, and burglary armed with a weapon. Charity was sentenced to 10.5 years in prison, and Dana was sentenced to 17.5 years, likely because she was the only one who was 18 or older at the time of the crimes. Rod had his sentence reduced to life in prison in 2000 and is still in prison today. In 2018, Scott was resentenced to 40 years in prison, making him eligible for parole in 2031. Charity was released from prison in 2006 and Dana in 2011. Some people still believe that Heather knew about or even planned the murders with Rod, but there's no evidence to support that. What we're left with is a teenager that was so convinced that he was really a monster that he let himself become one. If you're a fan of true crime, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. You can also hit like or leave us a comment. You can check out our other show, Somewhere Sinister, on YouTube or anywhere that you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to support the show, check out our merchandise at thisismonsters.com. The link is in the description. Thanks again, and be safe.